Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Friedman, the interim president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Broward County, and I want to welcome you all this evening to our program, The Israel-Palestinian Conflict Explained. With the recent conflict in Israel and the rise of anti-Semitism locally and globally, it is more important than ever for the Jewish people and all friends of Israel to be knowledgeable about Israel, its history, and its society. The Jewish Federation is committed to bringing factual information about Israel to the public. To this end, we have created new partnerships that will help us to disseminate knowledge to all segments of our community, Jewish and non-Jewish, including teens, college students, young adults, and as I said, the entire community. We're very pleased that in a few minutes, you'll be hearing from Lahav Harkov, who works for the Jerusalem Post, and she will be our special featured speaker talking about this complex and important issue for all of us. Today, we invite you to do three things. First, learn about Israel through these sessions and in the near future through our website at jewishbroward.org and those of our partner organizations. Take action, join in conversations with friends, such as those of you who are participating in watch parties tonight, planning on visiting Israel, whether on your own or through upcoming missions. More about that. We'll be hosting one in October of 2022, and communicate your support of Israel with your elected officials and with influencers. I might also add that tonight's broadcast is not going to be hosting questions from the audience, but we know that you might have some. So please, if you have any questions about the information that's imparted this evening, please contact Latal Donner at the Jewish Federation. Her email address will appear on the screen. It is ldonner, D-O-N-N-E-R, at jewishbroward.org. I also want to mention that in January of 2022, we will be hosting a community-wide program, Israel on Campus. So for those of you who have seniors that will be heading off to college next year, this will be a very important program, and Latal also has more information about that. And finally, help us to help Israel. Last month's conflict with Hamas brought so much damage to Israel, both physically and psychologically. If you have not already done so, please consider making a gift to our Israel Emergency Fund. Your contribution tonight benefits the Jewish Agency's Fund for Victims of Terror, the Israel Trauma Coalition, as well as providing special emergency funding for several of our Israeli partner agencies. Even though the rockets are silent now, the needs still continue, and we welcome and thank you in advance for your generous support. There will be a QR code on the screen that you will be able to make your donation directly. So please enjoy this series, listen, learn, and become more informed about this very complex issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict explained. Thank you again.
Good evening and welcome back. We hope you enjoyed the first session if you were present at it, and we're delighted to welcome you to this second session. I'm Rabbi Arnie Samlin, Chief Jewish Education Officer of the Jewish Federation of Broward County. It is our pleasure to once again introduce you to Lahav Harkov. Lahav is a senior contributing editor of Jerusalem Post, a diplomatic correspondent, someone who actually was born and grew up in New Jersey, made Aliyah at 17, and has very rapidly shot to the top of journalism in Israel, particularly English journalism. She is an expert on Israel's domestic and international politics. And we are just delighted to be able to learn from her once again this evening. So Lahav, thank you once again for joining us. I think it's of interest to those who are viewing this to understand how Israel's political system works. Israel's political system is radically different than that of the United States. When we talk about a president, we're talking about one thing. When Israelis do, they're talking about a different kind of position. Prime minister, you have one house of Congress where we have two, etc., and a whole different electoral system. So we would love for you to give us some idea of how that works, and particularly how that's worked this year and over the past few years, where there have been some interesting changes in the government.
So I like to start by imagining that it's election day, which, we've had 4 of those in the past 2 years or so. So it's not too hard to imagine for us Israelis. But anyway, in Israel, when it's election day, you show up at your polling place. You're supposed to bring ID with you. Voter ID is not controversial in Israel because there's mandatory ID for everyone from age 16. So you show your ID, you get taken behind a screen. There's a table there and a tray in front of you, which is divided into sections. Each section has a pile of slips of paper with each section with a different party name. It's actually an abbreviation for each party name. You pick the party that you want to vote for, and you put the slip of paper in an envelope. You come out from behind the screen and you drop the envelope in a ballot box. So Israel is the startup nation, but we are still voting with tiny slips of paper in ballot boxes. They're counted by computers though, although there have been some recounts lately that have been by hand. In any case, after the votes are counted, well, as I mentioned, you have an entire tray with all different slips of paper. So unlike in the US, where you have 2 major parties and then a lot of really small parties that don't really get anywhere, in Israel, you could have as many as 40 parties running. The average in recent years has been around 30. And about a dozen can get into the Knesset. That's what we have now. But the way you determine which of those 30 parties get into the Knesset is, of course, by how many votes they get. So there's an electoral threshold of 3.25%. Any party that gets below that threshold does not get into the Knesset. And then the 120 seats of the Knesset are divided up between the different parties that are left that got over the threshold. So Rabbi, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. Do you know why there are 120 seats in the Knesset?
So this is a historical significance, correct?
Yes.
Go ahead.
All right, so it is 120 is the number of Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the people of the Great Assembly, which was sort of a governing body of rabbis the last time there was Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel. And that's why the number 120 was chosen for the Knesset. There are a lot of, proposals sometimes to increase the numbers. There's a law now that almost increases the numbers in a strange way, which I'll get to later. But we have 120, sort of symbolizing that continuity, Jewish continuity in the land of Israel. Anyway, once you have 120 seats, as I told you, you could have about a dozen parties. So no one party has ever gotten a majority of seats in the Knesset. The largest faction ever in the Knesset was Golda Meir's Labor Party, or they were called the Alignment back then. In the early 1970s, they got, I believe it was 54 seats, but nobody has ever gotten a majority on their own, which means you need to build a coalition. So after the election, there's a process by which the parties recommend who they think the prime minister should be to the president. The president of Israel is mostly a symbolic figure, but the one time that he has real authority is after an election. He gets to choose who the next prime minister is, but he's supposed to base it on the recommendations from the different parties that got into the Knesset. So it's not like he could just choose anyone. And that person has to start negotiating to form a coalition. Negotiations usually take place on 2 tracks. One is policy, what things the government will put forward, and the other is jobs, which cabinet positions do the leading figures in the party want. Under normal circumstances, these negotiations go on for a month to 6 weeks, and then that person forms a government, and then we move forward with the political process. The past 2 years have been insane. And in early 2019, for the first time ever, we had a situation in which another election was called without a government being formed. Now this was, the Knesset dissolved itself and called a new election without giving a second person a chance to form an election, but in the subsequent elections, they followed the entire process delineated in Israel's basic law. Israel doesn't have a constitution, but they have these laws called basic law that function mostly like a constitution. So the process for those subsequent 3 elections was that Netanyahu was given the first chance to form a government. He was not able to, at least not the second, not the second time, and not the 4th time. Not the 3rd time either, come to think of it. They continued in this process. And then the person who got the second highest amount of recommendations for the political parties was given the chance to negotiate. In the second election, that person, who was Benny Gantz, the head of the Blue and White Party, could not form a government either. And so we went to another election. The 3rd time, Netanyahu and Gantz reached a compromise to form what was called a unity government with an agreement that they would rotate the job of prime minister, but that coalition was dysfunctional and fell apart before there could even be that rotation. And then we had a 4th election where there was, again, Netanyahu failed to form a coalition. And then the alternative, which was the person with the second greatest amount of votes, was Yair Lapid, head of the centrist Yesh Atid party. And he was able to form an interesting government. Now we're going to get to who all these people are, what their parties are, what they stand for soon. I'm just trying to explain the procedure first. So people often ask, how is an election called in Israel? Because I just mentioned a lot of elections being called. So again, under normal circumstances, when you have a government that lasts a few years, at a certain point, they stop working so well, or somebody in one of the parties in the coalition, usually the leading party, decides now is a good time for an election because I'm polling very well. And they stop getting along and voting as a unit. And then the Knesset can hold a vote to dissolve itself and to call a new election. It's usually 90 days later. So that is usually, that's really almost always the process by which an election is called in Israel. The maximum time there can be between one election and the next is basically 4 years and 11 months, because if a government sort of stays the course and fulfills its entire term, then it ends in the November of the 4th year. So, if there was an election in November, then it's exactly 4 years. But if the election is in January, then it's 4 years and 11 months.
The key questions for me as an American, and I know the answer, but I don't think others do. What about term limits? Are there term limits? Are there proposals for term limits?
And maybe I should have highlighted this a little bit more, but as I mentioned in the beginning, when you vote in an Israeli election, you vote for a party and not a person. So you're not actually voting for the prime minister. And so because there's no election for prime minister in the Israeli system, at least not currently, there was about a decade where they changed the system a little bit and then changed it back. But at the moment, you don't vote for prime minister, you vote for a party. And so the concept of term limits doesn't really fit into Israel's form of government. However, Netanyahu's been serving for 12 years. And so a lot of his opponents are now talking about instituting term limits because they think that it was too long and they don't want that to happen again in the future, which is what happened in the US, right? More or less why term limits were instituted. Netanyahu, FDR, very different people, but they both served about 12 years, if I remember correctly. And then there were term limits. So there is a high likelihood, I think, that this government will pass a law for term limits.
Thanks. So let's get a little bit of an introduction then to what the makeup is of this government. And I would say that this government is remarkably different than past coalitions. And I'd love for you to make a few observations on that.
Yeah, so usually you have governments that are, if not totally homogeneous ideologically, they have very similar aims. And then maybe there's one additional party sort of from the political center. Usually I mean in the past 20 years or so, excuse me. But so just between 2015 and 2019, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu led a fairly homogeneous right-wing government, which went from the sort of centrist to moderate right to the far right, with the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties in the middle that were not always right-wing per se. They used to sort of be their own thing, but they've migrated to the right along with their voters. The voters migrated to the right, so the parties did as well. And that was a government that lasted a very long time. It lasted almost 4 years, really. And so that's the norm. Sometimes, in the past, Netanyahu had governments that were mostly right wing, and then he had one party that was sort of more centrist in order to fill out the majority. This government runs the gamut from very solidly right wing, not the most right wing in the Knesset, but right wing, to the far left, as some centrist parties in the middle. And then there's also an Islamist party. So there's an Arab-led party that's religious Muslims, they're Islamists, and it's political Islam. And this is a first. There have not been Arab parties in ruling coalitions in Israel for decades, basically since the days of David Ben-Gurion. And even then, those Arab parties were sort of satellites of the ruling Labour Party and not really independent parties. So now we have this party. Now, it used to be, since 2013, the 4 different Arab parties in the Knesset ran as one bloc that they called the Joint List. And in 2020, in around the summer of 2020, after the unity government was formed, there started to be some cracks in that structure of the Joint List, because the leader of this Ra'am party, his name is Mansour Abbas, he started to feel that the Israeli Arab parties need to be more integrated into the political system. Legally, they could be as integrated as anyone else. It's their choice of participation. Well, their choice, and also sort of what was considered politically popular or not on the Jewish side as well, right? So there was political resistance. But on the Arab side, they didn't really want to join coalitions because they don't really agree that Israel should be the Jewish state. They don't agree with Israel's actions vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But Mansour Abbas said, you know what, we have so many civic issues that need to be dealt with that we need to cooperate more. We need to work more with the governments. And this caused a big break in the Joint List. And the other 3 parties ran together, and Abbas ran separately on this platform of, I'm going to try to be in the next coalition. And he did well enough on his own, which is something that, Arab parties running alone a few years ago, people didn't think that they would make it. But clearly this idea of greater participation in the political system is popular enough with the Israeli Arab public. So that is a huge change. And then, as I had started saying before, the diversity, the ideological diversity within this coalition is very rare. I don't want to say it's unprecedented because I haven't sat and done analysis of every government, but it certainly is unique, in the past 15, 20 years or so. And it's also going to make things difficult because, as I said, how do governments fall apart? How do you have elections called in Israel? It's when these coalitions are not able to work together and not able to get a majority to pass the things that they want to pass and get done. When you have so many different points of view, and every single day is a challenge to try to find the compromise that everyone can agree on, it's not so clear that this government will be stable and will last very long. I hope it will be, honestly, not even for any political opinions or supporting this person or that person, but just because after 2 years where we had one election after the other, I really think that stability is important for the proper functioning of the country. I mean, we've not had a budget since 2019.
Ignoring just for a second the Israel-Palestinian conflict, what are some of the other issues that separate the different parties and the different wings? You've talked a lot about left and right, and other than peace processes, what else distinguishes what you're calling a left party from a center party from a right party?
Well, overall in Israel, when people talk about left and right, they are talking about the peace process and security issues, with the right being more hawkish and the left being more dovish, and also the left being a proponent of greater concessions of land for peace, and the right opposing that entirely. So the left is for a 2-state solution. The center and left are for a 2-state solution, different varieties on it. Say Meretz, which is the far left party in this coalition, they want to return to pre-1967 lines. And then Yamina, which is the party of Naftali Bennett, who's currently Israel's prime minister, he opposes a 2-state solution. And he's for Israel extending its sovereignty or annexation of all the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, also called the West Bank, and a sort of allowing Palestinian autonomy in the other parts of it, which is only slightly different from what we have today. So when Israelis talk about right and left, they're usually talking about that. on other issues, on social issues, on the economy, they track fairly similarly with right and left in other countries. The gradations are different, right? Or the issues are different. Guns and abortion are not the big issues in Israel the way they are in the U.S. But the left is more for gay rights, and the right is for more traditional family things. In Israel, religion and state are a big issue because in Israel you have freedom of religion, but you don't have separation of religion and state, which means you can be whatever religion you want and sort of worship how you want in your house of worship. But the government also funds a lot of religious services, and there's controversy because basically they fund institutions that are run by Haredim, by the ultra-Orthodox, and there's talk about maybe it should be more modern Orthodox, maybe there should be more inclusion for Reform and conservative. So the further you get to the right, the more people want things to stay the way they are, very, very Orthodox. And on the left, people want to abolish religious services, government religious services entirely when you get to the extreme.
I guess we should also mention that, to my knowledge, Naftali Bennett is the first traditionally observant prime minister of Israel. Does that play a role in it, or is he going to turn out to actually be more centrist liberal on those kinds of issues?
Well, yeah, so Netanyahu, I keep in my writing.
You've got a few years of experience with that, yeah.
Yeah, it's like at the beginning of a year when you keep writing last year in the date, I'll get over it in a few weeks. Anyway, so Naftali Bennett, is the first sort of Orthodox prime minister. He's from the sort of religious Zionist movement, which is not identical, but similar to modern Orthodoxy in the US in some ways. And I think actually what I think is interesting is that he will be less lowercase c conservative as opposed to uppercase the conservative movement, but he'll be less conservative than some of his predecessors for a few on religion and state issues specifically, for a couple of reasons. First of all, this coalition doesn't have any ultra-Orthodox parties, and they usually require in all of their coalition agreements that they have the veto power over any decisions on religion and state. And second, and in that vein, Naftali Bennett is in favor of the religious institutions funded by the state remaining Orthodox, but that they be modern Orthodox, that there be significant reforms, that the process be sort of more opened up and allowed more variety. And he's for this coalition. One of the few things that I think this coalition will actually accomplish in religion and state, as opposed to just talking about it and disagreeing because they have different ideologies, is that they all agree on developing the egalitarian section of the Western Wall, where, if you are a conservative or reformed 13-year-old girl, you can read from the Torah there, as opposed to most of the Western Wall, which is run like an Orthodox synagogue. So that's the one thing that I think they're actually going to get done on religion and state. On other issues, Bennett is interesting because I think that when it comes to social issues, he is a moderate. He's not an ultra conservative the way some people might think about someone who's Orthodox. And he used to be the head of an Orthodox party, not a Haredi party, but an Orthodox party. He eventually started his own party that's a mix, that's half Orthodox, half secular or traditional. But he doesn't necessarily want gay marriage in Israel, but maybe would allow civil unions. Is more flexible about the way Shabbat would look in Israel, that certain towns that don't really have much of an Orthodox population might be able to have public transportation on those days. I'm not saying that that's the policy position he'll definitely take, but he's sort of more open on these social things.
So now the big question is, given that diversity, both within the Jewish population and within the Arab population, political diversity, social diversity, what does any of this augur? What does it predict in terms of settling to a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian situation?
I don't think that there's going to be much change with this government, because they really just have completely different views on what needs to be done, and their majority is so narrow, so they have to agree. So I think that they're going to mostly maintain the status quo. Bennett, the Prime Minister Bennett, very, very strongly opposes a two-state solution, but also holds the view that it's imperative on Israel to find ways to improve Palestinians' quality of life, that we can live more peacefully with them when they have better economic incentives and a better situation, that Israel should encourage economic cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. The Palestinians are currently on an anti-normalization kick. As I mentioned on the first part, when I visited in a group of journalists who were brought in by the Palestinian Authority, the restaurant that hosted us was attacked with Molotov cocktails that night. So even that, which seems sort of innocuous and a totally, you can't criticize it. I'm not sure that that will make any headway because of the Palestinians, even though the government, this coalition would probably agree to do that. There may be interesting developments in Gaza. Gaza, of course, is controlled by Hamas, and so it's a different situation. You know, Israel doesn't talk to Hamas, certainly not directly, but there are international efforts now to send humanitarian aid and to build certain homes that were destroyed in the last round of fighting because, you know, Hamas uses civilian structures to shoot rockets at Israel. And both Israel and the Western countries that donate, that give aid to the Palestinians, say there needs to be a better mechanism to figure out how to rebuild Gaza without the resources getting to Hamas, the terrorist group that controls Gaza. I don't know what the answer is, but I see that there is a lot of will to try to find an answer to that. And so I think that that's one place that this government could make headway, even though that's not a two-state solution, but it is a solution to a problem.
If it's not a two-state solution, what is it? Or what could it be?
Well, I don't think that this government is going to have a solution. I think that it's more of the status quo. Bennett has recently talked about it's called to reduce the conflict, which is a concept that comes from a recently published book. It was published in Hebrew a few years ago, and I think it was just translated into English last year, called Catch 67 by Micha Goodman. And he coined this term of reducing the conflict. I translate the Hebrew myself, so I don't know what they call it in English. They might call it something else. Actually, my friend actually translated the book, so I don't know what he called it. But which means, again, reducing the conflict is doing things like working on economic cooperation, working on ways to make the everyday life and coexistence of Palestinians and Israelis easier. That's not a final settlement on borders and refugees and things like that, but it is certainly, again, a way to improve people's lives.
So let's talk about the greater context of the Middle East for a second and how that impacts on things. A lot has been said, obviously, here in the States about the Abrahamic Accords. I believe you just came back from some travels, which I would love to hear about. Can you talk a little bit about what the Abrahamic Accords are for those who are not familiar with it? And does that make a difference in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Sure. So the Abraham Accords are a set of agreements between Israel and 4 Arab countries. It started with the United Arab Emirates, a peace agreement between Israel and the UAE. And then it went on to Bahrain almost immediately within a number of days. And then in the ensuing months, Sudan joined, and then Morocco. The idea, the concept behind the name Abraham Accords is that we are all the children of Abraham, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and that we should sort of unite and agree on our shared humanity and our shared belief in God and people being created in the image of God. Which is lovely. In practical terms, it's Israel having diplomatic relations with more countries in the region. Most of these countries, Israel, with the exception of Sudan, these are all countries with which Israel actually had fairly extensive relations that were secret. So now they're out in the open, and them being out in the open also facilitates a lot of business ties, tourism. Morocco is going to be a huge deal for tourism, I think, once COVID settles down more, because there are over 1 million Israelis of Moroccan origin. So I think people are going to be very excited about that. I was in Dubai about 2 weeks ago. We had the Jerusalem Post had a conference there together with the English language newspaper in Dubai called the Khalij Times. And it was very exciting. The Jerusalem Post sponsors about 2 conferences a year. And they're always very interesting, but the atmosphere at this one I felt was really special. Being there in Dubai as an Israeli, representing an Israeli newspaper, and people were really, locals were really enthusiastic about it. They wanted to find ways to cooperate. They wanted to learn more about Israel. And it was amazing because it also just happened a couple weeks after we had this last round of fighting with Gaza, and people were still really interested in working with Israel and learning more.
I think one of the things that I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce the name of the newspaper you just mentioned, but recently, I think as maybe just yesterday, they ran a piece on how the first student from United Arab Emirates is now at IDC in Herzliya, which is a wonderful institution that our community has some ties to. So that's just a really interesting development.
Yeah.
So how do these other countries relate to Hamas? How do they relate to Palestinians? Do they relate? Are they influencers? How does that all work?
There's a really interesting sort of regional story going on where there are two major axes sort of in the Middle East of the Sunni moderates and a mix of Sunni and Shiites on the more extremist end. So the Sunni moderates are, among others, we have the UAE, we have Bahrain, we have Egypt, and also Saudi Arabia, which as someone who grew up in America, who lived in America, and through 9/11, we're not used to hearing Saudis described as moderates, but they have sort of abandoned the path of violence in the name of Islam and sponsoring terrorism and things like that. And a lot of that is serving as a contra to and the more Iran and Muslim Brotherhood affiliated axis. All of these countries feel that Iran is a major threat to them, and that's part of what brought them closer to Israel over the years. And Saudi Arabia as well. Israel and Saudi Arabia have quote unquote secret ties. I think everyone kind of knows. It's been reported on fairly extensively, but they're not official normalized diplomatic ties. So when you talk about the broader regional story, the Iran nuclear threat was sort of brought together these strange bedfellows. When it comes to the Palestinians, they traditionally got support from all across the Middle East. The big donors to the Palestinians are all in the West and not the Arab countries, but they received political and some money from across the Middle East. But there are certain countries and certain leaders that have started to say, look, we believe the Palestinian cause is just, but that the Palestinian leadership has squandered so many opportunities that we're investing in something that's just not going to work. And they've said that in different sort of subtle ways, whether it's allowing articles with that message to be published in their tightly controlled media, allowing interviews with people who are very close to these kings making comments like that, and things like that. So the axis that is sort of supported with, the countries that are more aligned with Israel against Iran, they oppose Hamas. Hamas is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, Islamist extremists. They're also affiliated with Qatar, which runs Al Jazeera, who's the Saudis hate Al Jazeera. The Qataris and the Saudis do not get along. And so Hamas is considered on the other side, not on the side of these countries that Israel has growing ties with. But in theory, they're more supportive of the Palestinian Authority because the Palestinian Authority are moderates. When the Abrahamic Accords were announced, there was sort of a running theory that this would put pressure on the Palestinians to make progress with Israel because, the Palestinians sort of had veto power on relations between Israel and Arab countries, because there was something called the Arab Peace Plan passed by the Arab League that said that the entire Arab League would have diplomatic relations with Israel if there's a two-state solution, according to certain conditions that they laid out. Conditions that Israel would never meet, basically, because it would be the end of Israel as a Jewish state. And now 4 countries that are in the Arab League have said, no, we want the many benefits that we see in having relations with Israel. I don't think it's worked as leverage on the Palestinians to compromise or even come to the table with Israel. But I still think that we shouldn't discount the significance of the Abrahamic Accords and of the relations between Israel and these countries. I think it's historic, and I think it's great for Israel and the whole region.
So I'm not going to ask you how you voted in the U.S. elections, although I'm tempted to. But
I didn't vote.
But I will ask you, how do you see the change in the presidency, the change in Congress here in the U.S. Impacting both the U.S.-Israel relationships, and does it impact in any significant way the relationship and the balance between Israel and the Palestinians?
I often hear from a lot of American Jews, since the majority or the vast majority even of American Jews vote Democrat. I often hear from people, how do Israelis like Trump so much? Trump, throughout his presidency, was very popular in Israel, and I've seen polls that have said that Trump is more popular in Israel. It was Israel and Poland than any other country in the world. And the reason is that Israelis are looking at it from an Israeli perspective. They're just looking at what Trump did to Israel. They're not looking at, I mean, this is pre-January 6th anyway, but they're not looking at, anything else that he did that caused any kind of scandal in the US. And, so the things he's done for Israel are things that the majority of Israelis support, whether it's recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. These are things that were Israeli law for the past almost 40 years. They're not controversial for the vast majority of Israelis. And Israelis tend not to love when American presidents put pressure on Israel, even if they support a two-state solution. Ultimately, Israelis who support a two-state, a lot of them don't like the feeling that Israel's being bossed around. And Trump gave Israel a lot of leeway. Israelis overwhelmingly oppose the Iran deal. Trump left the Iran deal. So Trump is very popular in Israel, and Trump made life very easy for Netanyahu. That being said, President Biden has been a friend of Israel through his entire political career. He famously tells the story of his first visit to Israel in 1973. He met Golda Meir, and she showed him all these maps of the enemies that surrounded Israel. Jordan and Egypt had not made peace with Israel at that point, and Syria and Lebanon, and that they all are ready to attack Israel at any time. And Biden made a face, and he was very worried, and Golda could see it on his face. And she said to him, "Don't worry, we have a secret weapon." And as Biden tells it, he thought he was going to hear about some kind of missile system or something. And then she said, "We have nowhere else to go. That's the weapon." I find this story very powerful. Biden has told it many times. You can find videos of 2010, 2014, et cetera. Biden has professed that he is a Zionist. And if we want to talk toughness, if we want to talk about the what he's done, I mean, if we look at this last round of fighting with Gaza last month, I think he was very supportive of Israel, and he gave Israel the space that it needed to reach its military objectives. And then after the ceasefire, he's pledged to replenish Israel's Iron Dome batteries. I do think that Israel, the new government, and the Netanyahu government has a very strong disagreement with Biden about Iran. Israel does not view the Iran deal as something that will protect Israel from the existential threat of a nuclear Iran, because it basically expires in 2030. And Israeli governments view that as giving Iran the legitimacy to get a bomb in less than 10 years. And it also doesn't address Iranian aggression throughout the region. Iran funds all different kinds of proxies, including ones that attack Israel, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and Hezbollah, which has tens of thousands of missiles just waiting in southern Lebanon for whenever the next war happens. These are big concerns, and they're going to have to be addressed. In that way, things are going to be a little bit more difficult and maybe a little more tense than they were. Biden is somebody who doesn't like public confrontations between countries. He likes to go into a closed room and hash it out with the other leader. On the day we're speaking, he just met with Vladimir Putin, and even they came out seemingly, I'm not giving some sort of in-depth analysis of it, but even they were able to come out having made some progress. So hopefully things won't get too tense.
So if you're going to give any advice to Americans, and I realize this is a little bit of a tricky question, Americans who want to be friends of Israel, who are dealing with a lot of chatter going on in the background on social media, on the media in general, what would you suggest? How are Americans best able to be friends of Israel?
I think voting for people who support Israel, who support a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, is important. I think getting involved in political activism to help Israel is also helpful. The ways to help Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship is strong in many ways. It's not just military aid, even though that is very important. There's also business relationships. Israel's a leader in technology in many areas. The U.S. is the leader in technology, like basically every area, but Israel is high enough up there, the startup nation, that many Israeli tech companies are bought by American companies. Israeli sort of agricultural innovations are used in the U.S. And so if you're in business, trying to find ways to support Israeli companies or involve Israelis is also very helpful. And I find that the best way to spread the good word about Israel is through everyday interactions like that. If someone is working in a tech company and doesn't think about Israel ever, but has an Israeli colleague that they meet and they like, and they have positive experiences, then they'll hear good things maybe about Israel from that person, and that'll help change. So facilitating everyday meetings, everyday interactions between people and things that have to do with Israel or Israelis is also a very helpful way if you have ways to do that in your everyday life.
In terms of the peace process, as you've said, you think it's going to be a status quo for a while. Do you see a point at which well, first of all, where is progress being made in terms of cooperation? How does and probably there's no such thing as your average Arab, but how does the Arab population, particularly those that are citizens of Israel, how are they positioning themselves? And again, what are the hopeful spots?
Like, I can't really say that there's progress going on right now. It's not the most violent situation between Israel and Palestinians that we've ever had, thank God. But it's also not a situation where things are moving in the direction of progress. The Palestinians have a strong anti-normalization drive. They've also, brought charges against Israel in the International Criminal Court. So now Israel has reduced its sort of communications and cooperation with the Palestinian Authority in response to that. So it's not a great time for sort of diplomatic or even track 2 sort of progress between Israel and the Palestinians. Any sort of little points of light, of hope, are often smaller private things between organizations or companies that want to hire Palestinian workers, and it's those sort of everyday interactions that are ongoing. But even then, in the Palestinian population, you sort of have to be brave to do that because of this anti-normalization drive. As far as Israeli Arabs are concerned, I think there is a mix. A lot of activists on the Israeli left and also internationally who support sort of the Palestinian cause, they like to call Israeli Arabs Palestinian citizens of Israel. I've seen multiple polls in recent years that show that Israeli Arabs don't want to be called Palestinians, so I don't call them that. The Arab citizens of Israel is more or less the popular term, but it's pretty long, so I shorten it to Israeli Arabs. So some feel, I think the vast majority of them do sort of identify with the Palestinians in some way or another. It's a very small piece of land and they're all sort of related. But, it's a question of how much of a priority do people make it in their lives, right? And you see it with the Arab political parties where one has broken off and has said, like, I'm not going to put citizens of Israel's sort of everyday lives on hold because of the Palestinian cause. We're going to work on civic issues. And I think that is something that's growing in popularity. I think that more and more Israeli Arabs want to be better integrated into broader Israeli society. And I think more and more Jewish Israelis need to be open to that. And I think the numbers are growing, and I hope that they will grow more. There is some difficulty in the sense that Arabs want to send their children to Arabic speaking schools, and Jews want to send to Hebrew speaking schools. So at a young age, there's not a lot of interaction. And then when Hebrew is your second language and not your first language, sometimes it's harder to find work. So there are a lot of challenges to be overcome, but I think that they can be overcome.
So a lot of conversation takes place, and a lot of the I won't even call it dialogue more than they are shots in the dark, about oppression and inequality, etc. So, and recognizing that Israel is not the perfect society any more than America or any other country is. Nonetheless, where are the places where an Israeli Arab who chooses to be an Israeli citizen, where are they equal? Where are there places that they can't go?
Individual rights in Israel are equal, regardless of your religion, race, background, where you were born. As long as if you're a citizen, everyone can vote. Everyone has the same civil rights. There's two, I guess, big differences, which is that the law of return is just, there's a law that allows any Israeli anywhere, any Jew anywhere in the world who can prove that they're Jewish, or prove that they have one Jewish grandparent, can come to Israel and become a citizen. And that's not true to any Arab in the world, or even to just the Palestinian diaspora. So some people point to that as a form of inequality. But overall, when it comes to people who are living in Israel right now, they have equal rights. But I'm not going to deny that there's discrimination, right? That in any society, there's discrimination against minorities, and I hope that, you know, things will improve over time. I think the fact, the lack of political cooperation, in which both Jews and Jewish politicians and Arab politicians carry some of the blame, you know, has meant that certain government services have not served the Arab population as well. Because when you have stronger political representation for your constituents, then you often get better services for them. And so hopefully this coalition will make strides in that area.
So who are some of the voices that you respect, voices or publications or media stars that represent either the Arab population in Israel, and of course, who are the voices we ought to be paying attention to in the Israel side? And I'm going to add to that, we'll be resuming our work in conducting missions to Israel. Who do we want to be meeting with when we go there?
Well, you're asking about Israeli Arabs or more broadly?
I think both.
Okay, well, among Israeli Arabs, I cannot recommend highly enough that you speak to my colleague at the Jerusalem Post, Khaled Abu Tomeh. He is an expert on Palestinian affairs. He is often able to report on things going on in the Palestinian Authority that Palestinian journalists can't, because they don't really have freedom of press and you can be thrown into prison. So he is an incredible reporter on really interesting things going on in the Palestinian Authority, and of course is an Arab citizen of Israel and talks about that as well. Another person who I really like, his name is Youssef Haddad. He's all over social media, talks about, you know, life in Israel as an Arab. Really, really interesting person. And someone who I really greatly admire for many years now, his name is George Deek. He is Israel's ambassador to Uzbekistan right now. I met him when he was the charge d'affaires in Oslo, which meant that he was second to the ambassador, but at the time the ambassador had left. So he was sort of the interim ambassador to Norway. He has an amazing speech that he gave that you can find online about the place of Arabs in Israeli society. Again, he's an ambassador, so he has, you know, somebody who's integrated very well, I think, into Israeli society. Really interesting and impressive guy. So I recommend looking up George Deek, D-E-E-K. More broadly, I mean, there are so many people, and you can tell me what you're interested in, right? I mean, you can go to the Knesset and meet with different Knesset members. We now have a diaspora minister, Nachman Shai, who really wonderful man.
Got a fascinating history. He's got a fascinating career.
A really fascinating career. He was the spokesman of the IDF. He was the head of Israel's broadcast authority. He was a Knesset member from the Labor Party for several years, and now he is the Minister of Diaspora. Worth meeting if you're able to. You know, tell me what you're interested in. You know,
We'll be in touch. We'll be in touch on that.
Well, yeah, you know, it's a country of 10 million people.
So any closing comments? I'm watching the clock, and I know that we're soon reaching our time limit. What are some final points you want to make sure we all walk away with?
A lot of times I think American Jews view Israel as as an icon. It is their Jewish place, and they have ways that they dream about it. But I think people forget, and it's not just Jews. I also evangelical Christians do this as well, but in a different way. But people often forget that Israel is a real place full of real people. It's our country. We live there every day. We have everyday problems. We have everyday politics, maybe too mundane sometimes. And you should try to get to know us as people, because there are a lot of interesting people here, a lot of creative people, a lot of smart people who are doing things that are not just about the conflict, and so I think that it's great that Americans are getting a chance to see Israel through some of its TV shows, which have made it to Netflix and Amazon Prime, because then you do see a little bit more of who we are as people, and not just this faraway country that's full of meaning and holiness.
So I'm going to ask you a highly personal question. I hope you don't mind. You were 17 years old. You grew up in New Jersey, and chucked it all to go and move to Israel, go to school in Israel, become a journalist. What motivated you, and was it the right decision? And are you always sure it's the right decision for you?
So first of all, I'll answer your last question first. I'm 100% certain it's the right decision. I am doing exactly the work that I dreamed of doing when I was like 13 years old and thinking about what I want to be when I grew up. It was exactly this. It was the second Intifada. I wanted to be a writer when I grew up, and I said, I want to be a writer who tells the true story about Israel, because I saw so many things that my cousins and my family in Israel were telling me were wrong about Israel, in the American media. So and of course the fact that I met my husband here, I have children here, but I don't regret moving to Israel for one moment. It's been a dream come true for me, literally. But my mother is born in Israel. I grew up speaking Hebrew with her in the house, and also to my grandparents who had moved to America when my mom was a child. And we went to Israel every year. I often went for summers. I have a lot of extended family here, and it felt like a second home to me. And as a teenager, I became more and more involved in sort of pro-Israel activism, and I spent more and more time here on my own in the summers. And I just felt like this was home. This was where I wanted to be, and that this is where the future of the Jewish people lies, and that I want to be part of this amazing project that is Israel. So it's corny. It's, what they teach you in your Zionist summer camp. But that's it. I lived it, and I love it. I'm very happy here.
Excellent. So we want to thank you again for taking time away from your incredibly busy schedule, from your kids, from your family, young kids, I should add, and for being with us and helping both not only to educate us, but more importantly, to inspire us. And the last few minutes especially were particularly inspirational, and we thank you for that. I want to really jump back to something you said as we close our session. All of us are influencers. All of us who are on this webinars are influencers and have the opportunity to not whitewash Israel, but to really express what Lahav expressed just a few moments ago, which is that Israel is a real place with real people, real everyday lives. It's not a perfect place, but it's a pretty darn good one. And each of us is an influencer with those around us. A lot of people are getting their information from a good many sources, some reliable, a good many not. And the more that we can continue the conversations with our families, with our friends, with everyone, the better we're going to be, and the better our relationship with Israel is going to be. We urge everyone to continue their study, their learning, whether it's through video, through reading, however you are going to deepen your learning. And Lahav, on behalf of all of us here in the Broward County community, we want to thank you for being an outstanding resource for us. And we thank you again for being with us. We thank all of you in the community for being with us. All the best wishes to you, and we look forward to seeing you here in person, God willing, soon in the future, and to having you accompany us when we take our trips to Israel in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.